A few of you might recognize me from my Kickstarter campaign. I'm writing a book about EVE Online called A History of the Great Empires of EVE Online. It's all about Nullsec history and many of the great things that very particularly large player groups have done in EVE. So my project began back about a year and a half ago after I was laid off from my job at the Penny Arcade Report. I had done a lot of EVE reporting there at the time and just found the whole game just unbelievably fascinating. It was just a constant source of inspiration when wanting to do features and original things in the gaming press, and kind of fell in love with it. And then when the Penny Arcade Report closed, I had tons of time on my hands and didn't really know what to do with it, and I kept reading about EVE. I kept learning more about it. And I found myself on the EVE wikis and starting to understand just a little bit about how deeply fascinating the story of Nullsec can be. And I kind of became obsessed with trying to understand the order of events and trying to understand what causality really means in Nullsec and how much one event leads to another. The whole time I was working on it for like 8 months, and I was just completely blown away that it had never been done before. I was working on it for months and months and months, and all the while I was completely 100% sure that eventually I was going to find out that what I was doing was worthless, and it had already been done many, many times before. And I began to realize that so much of the problem of why it had never been done before is because there's this sort of entropy factor to the internet, where if you write something down on a wiki, eventually that wiki gets shut down and it's lost. And maybe you could find it on the Internet Archive, but it's not really that accessible, and you have to look. It's like a needle in a haystack kind of thing. Some people write on the forums, but not many. And when those archives are lost, those are gone too. And eventually we lose the entire story, and that became kind of a scary thing to me, that there's this virtual world out there, there's this really fascinating story that one day we could completely lose. And I get very techno-philosophical about the whole thing, and I find it to be this really like rabbit hole of humanity that we kind of went down, and we don't even know what's happening for a lot of people. I mean, everybody here does, but people on the outside, they don't understand that this is a thing. There's this human story, this incredibly human aspect of it, where people, really fantastic leaders in a global context, and it's worth documenting that. And so we did a Kickstarter for it, starting in April 2014. The original plan was to launch an ebook, and I eventually very quickly realized that that was basically the same thing as writing a wiki. Eventually it was going to be lost, and then all of it would be for nothing. So 30, 40, 50 years from now, in a historical context, it was basically like doing nothing at all. So we raised funds for a Kickstarter to try and get the book into libraries, try and make sure that it didn't all eventually go away immediately after it launched. And it turned out a lot of people were just as excited about this idea as I was. And we raised a lot more money than I thought we were going to be able to. The funding goal for this project was reached in just 7 hours, and the final tally was 765% of the funding. And if any of you here were backers, I can't thank you enough. It's completely changed how I live my life. And the book is so much better for having been done on Kickstarter. I won't get into too much, but I got a presentation to do. So we received a lot of coverage, won't go into that. So I became a full-time internet spaceship historian, which is probably the first time anybody's ever had that job before. I started working on it full-time. Now I spend hundreds upon hundreds of hours on the forums, and I know that probably sounds a little bit weird to a lot of you who read the forums nowadays, but back in 2003, 4, 5, 6, and even 2007, people actually used the forums to like announce their wars and to give their list of grievances against their aggressors, that sort of thing. Like when people were playing in sort of a role-play persona back in 2003, 4, 5, 6, the forums were actually an invaluable historical resource. And so once I would spend hundreds of hours working on those forums, I would go back and I would find all of those people who seemed to be movers and shakers in those times, and I would interview them and try to understand the context and try to understand the causality and why everything fit together the way that it did. And so what we found eventually is that Nullsec is one story that has progressed over the last 12 years, and is just a fascinating drama by any context, regardless of the fact that it's real. We can skip that. CCP scared me a lot about how, like, what they're going to do to me if I run over my time, so I'm trying to skip through a lot of the stuff that I don't absolutely need to go through. So what we're going to do is we're going to talk about a story of something that happened back in July in 2006. And so this is what Nullsec looked like back in July of 2006. Very, very different than it looks today. So we have over here, we have Band of Brothers, who many of you will remember if you've read stories about the Great War or anything like that. Band of Brothers controls most of the East at this time, the West. And, so Band of Brothers, they're very militaristic, they're very aggressive, they pour all of their money into their military. It's really all they're interested in doing is combat and invasion. And then further down south here, we have Ascendant Frontier. We're gonna ignore most of those little blurbs in the middle because they're interesting in their own right, but they're not particularly eventful in this time. They weren't doing a whole lot. So we move further down south. Ascendant Frontier is this sort of like engineer empire where all they care about is building. All they want to do is build more stuff. So they build tons of outposts. They build just these huge dreadnought fleets. And then over here we have this sort of chaotic mess up in the southeast that is very jumbled and hard to understand if you've never looked at a Slav map before, but it's actually very, very simple. So all of these individual dots, except for the red one, are in a coalition called the Coalition of the South. So Lacca Volterra, Chimera Pact, Knights of the South, and Veritas Immortalis, all of them are the Coalition of the South, and their whole mission in life is to drive Red Alliance out of existence. And Red Alliance is that little blurb right up there. And so right before this happened, you might know a story about something called the Siege of CJ6. And right before this happened, the Coalition of the South came together, and Red Alliance controlled almost all of the entire Southeast. So all of these little smaller things, Lacca Volterra, Chimera Pact, all of that was red. And the Coalition of the South came together and drove them back to that one little blip of space right there. And in this fantastic last stand, Red Alliance held their ground and managed to preserve just that little blip right there. Okay, so those are the major players we have in the South, and so the political situation is actually very simple. They all play the game in sort of a similar way. They all really like each other. They're all sort of this role play, very, very serious about the game. And the only thing that really, really bound them together was they hate Red Alliance. And so the one thing that I didn't mention before on that map is that Red Alliance, right when they got pushed back to that tiny little blip, they went out looking for allies because they realized they couldn't stand on their own anymore. And the people that they found were the only other people in EVE who were as disliked as they were, which was the Groen Swarm. And that's not to cast any commentary about either of those people, but they were both sort of this pariah at the time. So those major power blocks in the South, they all viewed the game very, very differently than Groen Swarm or Red Alliance. And so those two got together. There was this sort of shady pub meeting where the Mittani and Vile Rat met up with UAX Death in Washington, D.C. in a pub called Fido's. And they shook hands and drank, and the alliance was sealed forevermore after that. Let's see. Okay, so what Band of Brothers doesn't know, remember Band of Brothers controls all of the West at the time, is that they're about to help out Red Swarm in a huge way, in a historical way. So again, Band of Brothers, very militaristic, very antagonistic. Ascendant Frontier, very isolationist. They just want to keep themselves. They've created their big empire, and all they want to do is just tend to that empire and sow their crops, so to speak. And now the Coalition of the South, they're all independent alliances, and they don't really like each other that much. Their whole purpose was to drive away Red Alliance. And eventually, Red Alliance stopped them on that red blip that you saw there. And so now they're like, why are we together? If we're not achieving our one goal in life, then what's the point? And so they start kind of fraying and not really working together the same way they used to. A little out of order, but that's okay. So Red Alliance and Groen Swarm form Red Swarm Federation. Okay, and so there's 3 months pass. And so basically everything has stayed the same on this map except for up there. And the union between Red Alliance and Red Swarm has proven fantastically productive, and they've expanded out from that one little blip, and now they control almost all of 2 regions. And so, let's see, okay. So what happens here is Locke of Volterra down there, they're starting to get a little bit nervous because they know that they're next. They're part of the coalition to the south, and Red Swarm wants to get their revenge on the coalition to the south and drive them out of existence in exchange for what they tried to do to Red Alliance. So Ascendant Frontier, though, is not particularly worried about all of this because they were just about to put the finishing touches on the very first Titan ever to be created in EVE Online. Remember, they were fantastic builders. And Red Swarm's whole thing, their whole shtick, was that they had hundreds, maybe even thousands of people in a fleet in a time when that was completely unprecedented. And they would show up, and they would show up in just crappy ships, random fits, nothing really made a real good fleet sense, but there were so many of them that it didn't matter. Sometimes they would just crash the server, and then by luck, almost, they would just come in and they would be the first to get in the login queue and just wipe out the enemy fleet. Sometimes they were fantastically effective and brilliant tacticians, but sometimes it was just the numbers that they had. And so Ascendant Frontier isn't that worried about this because they're building their Titan. And remember, back at that time, some of you new players might not know this, but Titans at the time were not a single target massive damage attack. They were a big 500-kilometer radius area of effect attack, and they would basically wipe out anything smaller than a dreadnought. So mass numbers were completely useless because you could have 1,000 people in that fleet, and if you warped in and got off a good doomsday, you could kill the entire fleet, and it didn't matter. Nothing mattered. And so on September 25th, 2006, the Titan is finished. First Titan ever created, and they name it Steve. One of the great little nice, fun footnotes from EVE history that keep it from getting too serious, internet spaceship business. I don't.
Steve Irwin.
I wasn't. Oh, that's right, I had heard about that. Yeah, what he just said, if you can't hear it, is that it was actually named after Steve Irwin, who had just passed at the time. So 3 days later, I clicked too soon and spoiled the story. Band of Brothers pulls off this completely random move. No one knows why it happens. It comes out of nowhere, so maybe you guys got the true flavor of it right there. They declare war on Ascendant Frontier 3 days later. And here we have Sir Mully, who takes to the Evo forums and announces it with this. He was so fantastically over the top when it came to his sort of space dictator persona. And so he announces it with this completely cryptic adaptation of a poem called Examination at Midnight by Ashton Clark Smith, where he says, "The pendulum with brazen din proclaims the midnight. We begin to call to mind, ironically, what uses we have made of this dead day that drops to the abyss. Today, O date prophetical, Friday 29, in somber folly, Mogre, the truths of our heart maintain. We, seeing still the light that saints have walked in ways heretical, the pendulum is about to swing." I love this guy. He's so much fun to write about from a historical perspective. So the Ascendant Frontier War begins. And let me see, what does it say? So everybody's really pissed about this because they're starting to see what kind of an effect Red Swarm is having, this new union that no one really understood how it would work out, the really tiny Red Alliance and the massive but inexperienced Goon Swarm. And it's working out really well. You saw they conquered already 2 regions in about 2.5 months. So everybody's pissed about it. Locke of Volterra is sitting there saying, we're fighting for our life here, and you guys are just starting a war with our main ally over in the south, Ascendant Frontier. We're supposed to all be working together. Why is this happening? Band of Brothers claims in retrospect that this war was just for entertainment. I actually doubt this, considering it happened just 3 days after the first Titan ever was born. We have actually a representative from Evolution, which was the main corporation in Band of Brothers, here with us today. I still am going to doubt it no matter what he says, because that's my job as a historian. I think that this was a war for pride. I think it was Band of Brothers saw that Ascendant Frontier was maybe even a little bit more feared than them now that they had a Titan. They were a little bit worried that this idea of engineers, people who built, were going to take over the game just with their building prowess. And I think they also wanted to kill the first Titan. That's a legendary, decade-long. No one will ever forget who killed the first Titan or who built the first Titan. So if you can't build the first one, might as well destroy it. So yeah, the Band of Brothers had no idea that they were doing this huge favor to Red Swarm by taking Ascendant Frontier out of the war completely. The leader of Ascendant Frontier is a man named Sivok, and he's basically pleading with Sir Mully, the leader of Band of Brothers, to recognize what a threat Red Swarm is and that they need to back off and all work together to clean this up, and then they can have their war. And so when that doesn't work, Sivok rallies Ascendant Frontier and reluctantly prepares to meet Band of Brothers head on. And he told me this in our interview not too long ago. This actually is not his avatar portrait. For my book, we had portraits made for people who were of particular significance in leading empires in the game. This is what our artist came up with. And he says, Groen Swarm and the Red Alliance are going to overwhelm this game. If Band of Brothers and Ascendant Frontier go to war, both of us are going to be destroyed. Sir Mully, at the time, in his arrogance, believed that that was bullshit. That Ascendant Frontier was a weak, pathetic alliance, that we were not worth our weight, that we would eventually ruin the game. And when he's referring to the idea of builders taking precedence over military-focused alliances. And so now in a blog post to the rest of his alliance at the time, back in 2006, he writes, we have chosen to meet this latest challenge head on, and as always, we will not back down. Once again, we call upon our leaders and most of all our citizens to build our front lines and take those lines to our enemy. The Ascendant Frontier was built on the backs of our citizens, and now its fate is in your hands. Ascendant Frontier will once again earn its freedom and its right to exist in this universe. Ascendant Frontier is strength. We are unity, honor and serve. Sivok, Ascendant Frontier. I love this guy too. They're so much fun to write about. And so this war begins. It turns out, in the historical retrospect, to be a relatively short war. Band of Brothers attacks directly into Paragon Sol down there. And Ascendant Frontier at first is doing extremely well. They've stopped them completely cold in Paragon Sol, and they're sort of jabbing at each other. Both of these titanic empires aren't really sure what to do with each other. I'm going to speed up because I don't want to put us behind. So they kind of end up in a stalemate in Paragon Sol, and they're not really sure what to do. And all the while, Ascendant Frontier has so many people. They have many more members than Band of Brothers, and they're sending, while they're doing their sort of major war in Paragon Sol, they're sending skirmish attacks over into Delve and Quarius. The reason why there's that warning sign right down there is because they were actually attacking Mercenary Coalition at the time, which isn't shown on this map, but they almost dragged Mercenary Coalition into the war, which is a fun side note for me. Eventually, Band of Brothers manages to take Paragon Sol. Paragon Sol falls. Eventually, Esoteria falls as well. And they have Ascendant Frontier down to basically their last region, which is Phaethobolus. Phaethobolus it's a fortress. There's no way in. Basically, complete moon control over the entire region. And there's no way to break in. Sir Mully himself said that it was basically impossible for them to manage. And so they start doing raiding attacks into the region, and they try to bang on the front door of Ascendant Frontier, and just try to antagonize them out and get them to come out of Phaethobolus for a fight. And on December 7th, that actually happens. Sivok brings his Titan out to a major fleet engagement in C9NCC, and in a pitched battle, Steve dies. In highly controversial circumstances, which could be a presentation all of its own, but we won't go into it. It did not crash, but Steve accidentally ran into the sun or something, I don't know. So the problem with that is that this is the crown jewel of Ascendant Frontier's empire, and this causes Sivok so much distress that he just quits the game. He had been working like 80 hours a week at his regular job and 60 hours a week in his space job, and it just is too much stress, and he freaks out and kind of quits. I shouldn't say freaks out. He's a very, very intelligent person, a very good leader. But it turns out that he was the only thing that was holding Ascendant Frontier together. Without him, it spirals into destruction, and by January 1st, 2007, Ascendant Frontier is gone, and the game map looks like this instead. We see Band of Brothers has flooded into Ascendant Frontier's territory and taken it, and in the meantime, Red Swarm has flooded through the coalition to the south and gotten rid of every single other alliance. Curse Alliance up there is basically supported by Red Alliance as well, so that is almost their territory as well, and they start banging on Lock of Volterra as well. And Lock of Volterra doesn't put up that much of a fight. They are proven in history to be kind of a paper tiger. Let's see. We just did that. Trying to get through this in a couple minutes. All right, so then this is what the map looks like just 2 months after that, where Red Swarm is still completely rolling over there. And they have conquered almost the entire south. And this is, as you might have figured out by now, the beginning of what we now know as the Great War, where Red Swarm and Band of Brothers collide in spectacular circumstances. And it's a wonderful story, but the question that I get to ask as a historian is what would have happened if they hadn't rolled over Ascendant Frontier? If Ascendant Frontier, Lock of Volterra, and Band of Brothers all worked together to stop Red Swarm, there likely never would have been a Great War. Red Swarm probably would have been completely just strangled in its crib, and we wouldn't even be talking about this today. These sort of geopolitical buffers work really, really well, and even if the coalition of the South fell, but Ascendant Frontier didn't, they probably would have been stopped. They wouldn't have been able to get through Ascendant Frontier. After all of that, it would have been too much resistance. So in conclusion, in like 1 minute, there's kind of two ways to view this. On the one hand, it's you can view it kind of like I do, which is you can call your presentation The Great Mistake, because after the Great War, spoilers for my book, Band of Brothers does not survive this war, and it eventually leads to their destruction. But on the other hand, as a member of Evolution told me, so take this with a grain of salt, you can view this as a tremendous success as well, because Band of Brothers gets to fight in the Ascendant Frontier War, which was the biggest war of its time, and then eventually in the Great War. So this leads to 3 years of the most amazing wars you've ever seen in EVE Online. Just terrific, terrific content for their players, and so much fun, but very stressful. So you can kind of decide for yourself whether this was a success or a failure for Band of Brothers. And that is the end of my presentation. Thank you so much for coming. Oh, and I brought a snippet of my book to share with people, so if you feel like taking a sneak peek at what it will look like, I brought 2 chapters with, so you can take a look at how it's shaping up. Thank you again.